Okay, Napoleon Against Europe. This is, well, I don't know if you watched the intro or not, but this is the second big Napoleonic campaign game by this designer. And this one he chose to go with, his other one was Nations at Arms. This one he chose to go with a smaller game, although it took me forever to play, but that's just because I wasn't enjoying it and I was dreading the actual play. And that doesn't necessarily say it's a bad game, but it has more to do with my recent, or not that recent, but my slow disengagement from CDGs in general, but also realizing that there are a lot of CDGs out there that don't meet my narrow taste band of where they are, and it's always hard to tell where they're going to fall. But I'm beginning to refine where I like my CDGs. I definitely like them on the beyond strategic level. When you look at the Here I Stand or something like that, where you're or Twilight Struggle, where you're controlling, something that the combat is going to be so abstracted in, that the military issues and the problems that CDGs have in representing them, for me at least, kind of disappear. The abstraction gets high enough, it becomes, like a Britannia type game. You don't really worry too much about, oh, that just couldn't happen. And they also tend to have, for the ones that are military, they tend to have a simpler map design. Say like Wilderness War, which really channels the structuring of where you can fight. And I feel the more complicated the map gets, the harder some of the mental tasks become. And that definitely afflicted this. That also afflicted, things like For the People, which it makes it much, much harder to make any decision. And the harder a decision is, the less I want to even play it. And that, comes to play with things like Paths of Glory or whatever. If you play it a few times, you start to get used to the flow of it, and you can put that aside. And certainly, it's not a real hit against the game to say that it requires thought or, something along that lines. That gives it room for the kind of strategic depth that some of these games have. And I think this one may well. So that's not a negative against it. The components are actually beautiful. The card's fairly standard type of cards, nicely shuffleable, separated into decks for the two players. It's a two-player game, and further separated into two periods. One for the early era, or the epic, where Napoleon is on, the rise, and then where he's more waning is the punishments deck, which should hurt him more. It should be more negative for him. And the way those trigger is through this concept of the escalade. The more things that happen, and it doesn't really matter who they happen for, good things, bad things, from either side, they drive the escalade up, and eventually it hits a point where all of Europe's sick and tired of Napoleon, and it starts to show in the cards. But the deck gets much larger, and it gets a little bit more random. So you have less control over your deck at that point. The counters, really, really beautiful. They already are rounded. Somebody clipped them, before they sent them out in the counter sheet. A little bit of flash on the edges, no problem. Nice texture. There is at least one misprint on a counter. And there may be more than that. And this is kind of telling, because the new edition is not going to include any changes to the counter set. Maybe nobody's caught this, but there was clearly one that was misprinted. A decent number of play aids. There will be more in the new edition. By the way, I ordered the upgrade kit, which basically gives you the new play aids and a new robot. The new play aids looked useful. I like my cardboard. They also make some corrections to some issues on them. We'll see how big a deal they are at some point or another, maybe, if I get back to this. The board is a mounted board, and it's really beautiful. It really is. It reminds you of a kind of shrunk down Empires and Arms board. The fact that it's shrunk down causes a problem every now and then. Sometimes there's not enough space to keep all the information you want without kind of cluttering the board a little bit too much. But it is serviceable, and it is really, really beautiful. And it's got this kind of discoloring that makes it look like it's dirty. I like that, because then when I get it dirty, I can't tell that I've damaged it. The problem that I have with the map has to do with the fact that it's a CDG, that it is kind of tightly compacted. It's hard to assess all the information, just like in some of the bubble maps, like Paths of Glory, Triumph of Chaos, that are really, really kind of cluttered maps with lots of connections. Well, I thought you give me an area map and I wouldn't have the problem, but I haven't really seen too many area game CDGs, and in this case there's so many small areas that they have all that complexity of connectivity. And what I thought would be helpful, which was just the being able to see things better, it didn't turn out as useful as I thought. And one of the reasons maybe they're a little too busy in terms of the border differentials that are being shown. So for example, there are provinces or whatever that have some political effect, and then they're divided up further into little actual movement zones, etc. And then you have your river lines, your national borders, and all this kind of stuff. And sometimes it's hard to tell what the hell something is, especially when there's a clutter of pieces on them. On the other hand, the rule book I do not like. Number one, it's glossy. It means you can't write corrections in it. And there are a fair number of corrections. Number two, full color. It's laid out like a GMT CDG rule book. I think that it's just hard to qualify and distill specific subsystems as well in these CDGs. Movement, combat, sometimes these are all kind of cluttered together in different ways. And it's also all the different use of color is distracting and confusing. I mean, we have examples in blue, exceptions in red. It's too much for me. For the second edition rulebook, it doesn't look significantly different. I looked up several things and couldn't find solutions to the ambiguities, to the questions that I had in general. In some places there are differences, but overall it's pretty close, and I'm not quite sure it was worth redoing the rulebook given that. The actual play of the game, again, the complexity of the board and the complexity of the choices that you're facing make it a very, very tough game for me to play. On the other hand, that might be very pleasant for the more competitive player. The negative on the competitive player is, of course, the rulebook sucks and has some ambiguities, and you're really going to have to nail it down and correct the rulebook, even the second edition rulebook, if you want to try to achieve that. It looks to me like kind of reminding me a little bit of Unconditional Surrender here, although it's a smaller game. Like there's a balance kind of baked into it. You go take England, there's going to be a counterweight against you, just kind of baked into the system. And it's nothing as apparent like the victory point track. It's just that Napoleon's effort in England means that he's not going to be able to get the gains that he historically got in Central Europe against the Germans, which means you're going to be behind in victory points in terms of what you gain in Germany, but you're going to come out ahead overall because of England. On the other hand, it may also put you in a difficult position because there are cards that are based more on the, hey, I want to succeed in getting these things done kind of early so I can score some points off them. So there's some kind of hidden points that it's not so clear that you're making that trade-off until you've played the game a little bit. Okay. Beyond the board complexity causing me certain mental distress, something I think is much more painful is there's a lot of counting in this game. You're constantly counting the number of steps of units you have under a given commander, trying to make sure you have the right amount, trying to make sure you don't screw up, stuff like that. There's also going to be a significant number of rules lookups. This is because it doesn't, it is a CDG and you can never be sure, oh wait, how's interception handled in this game? Once you have a few of these under your belt, they start getting really kind of confusing and blurring together. And I found myself constantly looking things up for modifiers for this, that, and the other. Some of that is in the charts. You start to get more used to it as it's there. But there's a high cost to getting ramped up to that. Now, if this became your go-to game for competitive play, or a go-to game that you play, several times a year, that's not going to be a big deal. You'll remember it well enough. But, first time playing or once every few years, you're probably going to have that kind of struggle. And that's the way I play games in general, is I don't play them too many times often. Okay. I was talking about the kinds of CDGs that I kind of favor for military operations, and here I was looking at, something like Wilderness War that really has a couple of channels, works well because likely play will have the sides facing each other off. There's no quick, easy breakthrough. There's nothing really apparent that you could do there if you could move more of your forces at once or whatever, in general. When you get to games that have more complex maps, that have more connectivity, I feel like the CDG kind of breaks down. It's harder to justify what's happening on the board. So, for example, here you might see an advantage on one front or one theater and start moving heavily on that one, and your opponent has to react, and all your cards for the year get spent there, even though you're at war somewhere else. Where this comes the worst, at least from my taste of the game, whatever, is that naval movement precludes anything else. If both sides are engaged heavily in the naval operations, hey, there goes any advances by either side in Central Europe at the beginning of the game. So the invasion of England not just handcuffs Napoleon from moving into Central Europe, but it seems to kind of handcuff the Germans or the Austrians and Russians from doing much against Napoleon as well, whereas they would have had a fairly free hand and were busy there. There's some scripting in play to try to prevent that, to try to give the French a chance to take on England, and that kind of forces a little bit of the coalition's hand in that sense, but you still don't feel like the war is developing as it would under those circumstances. And that kind of historical hit, that really disturbs me. And that's where I feel there's certain CDGs that manage to accurately represent history, and then there's a lot that just really don't do it because of the constraints that the cards put on you. The fact that, you can look at an army and say, yeah, it could move as far as you're talking. But what you don't get is the kind of broad front movement that sometimes happened, at least on Napoleon's side, where he had his forces spread out to avoid attrition, etc. Maybe that's being abstracted in the genius of Napoleon or whatever, but which is a card which allows him to avoid some attrition personally with the Grand Army. But it just feels like there'll be one central area where the conflicts are all happening for a turn, and then everything else is kind of a backwater. It's hard for you to get any points at all down there. Now that happens with a lot of CDGs. There's no question about that. Where it doesn't seem to hurt is where there's channeling and where there's really not a lot of opportunities. Now, games where there's not a lot of opportunities may not seem as competitively viable, although obviously Wilderness War is perfectly fine. My example there is actually probably goes to Amateurs at Arms, which is sort of this chaos game. But there's a lot of channeling going on there. So, anyway. At the end of the game, there's a certain degree of scripting, too, which is much more painful than the beginning game scripting for me. What it comes down to is the victory conditions. The victory conditions in the main of the game are, hey, Napoleon wants to do well and get, all kind of things done. And if he can drive the score up high enough, he wins. Nothing about his future, whatever. He just wins. And likewise, if he does really horribly, he can lose. But that's going to be very unlikely. If it gets to 1814, not 1850, 1814. At the end of 1814, the game ends automatically. The campaign does. There's an 1815 scenario to handle the 100 days, and I did that as a kind of training exercise. If you get to the end of 1814, if Napoleon has lost all of the French key cities, the coalition wins. If he holds all of them, Napoleon wins. And if it's somewhere in between that, neither side wins. And it brings it to this kind of sudden death on that turn, which means if you can't achieve your needed victory by a certain date, just pumping the score up higher and higher as Napoleon, at some point or another, you just collapse back into France and defend it. And that becomes your goal. And it ends up feeling, at least in the game that I was playing, that it was happening at kind of the wrong time. That a couple more years should have passed before it got to that stage. As a competitive game, it may work perfectly fine. As a representation of the historical situation and the forces that are acting on these decisions, it seems completely bogus to me. And I would rather play Napoleonic fantasy, i.e. Empires in Arms, which doesn't seem as constrained by that, although it can get to some problems at the end of the game as well. And again, like I said, with the competitive game, probably the biggest hit against it, although, again, you'd have to play it a dozen times to be able to judge one way or another, how well it holds up as a competitive game. But as a competitive game, its weakest situation is that it has these kind of ambiguous roles that are going to require some kind of decision to be made. And maybe those decisions are available over on Consim World. Maybe you can puzzle out a good argument on your own, but it's a little fuzzy. It's not an American design. French tend to, I think it's a French company, tend to, it better be given that everything's kind of in French. A lot of the names are in French on the board, etc. Not just the French ones. What I've found is French tend to be a little bit looser. And that can be very pleasant in terms of making rules easier to read. In this case, I didn't feel like they did a terribly good job on that direction, and they definitely didn't do a good job of nailing everything down really well. And I don't think the second edition rules did that much better, from what I've seen. Where does it sit in the milieu of the Napoleonic games? Well, it's lighter than than Nation is at Arms, than Empires in Arms. It's heavier than your Age of Napoleon. It's a little bit heavier than Napoleonic Wars, and a little bit more detailed. I don't feel, due to the CDG effects in this game, that with naive play, it's a better simulation than Napoleonic Wars, or gives you better historical feel. Which is, you know, the big hit against Napoleonic Wars is that it's so ahistorical. What I found with Napoleonic Wars is if you play kind of as a naive first-time player, it actually does a fair job. If you play against a shark in that game, you start to see exploits being used, or if you start studying it, I'm sure you start seeing them. But you start to see exploits that are very ahistorical in flavor. And I don't know whether or not this is going to have that same indication. What I see more with this is the things that drive you to do something don't feel like the proper historical reasons, the causes. And that hurts me more than some inaccuracy in how things, you know, play out maybe. So for example, La Grande Guerre, I have no problem with the naval, well, I do have a problem, but the naval system I'm willing to close my eyes towards, even though it gives what I think are ahistorical results, and some other things in it give ahistorical results. But I feel like the driving forces in that game really push you into making historically reasonable decisions. In an alternative, something like Paths of Glory, I feel forces you into making decisions for ahistorical reasons. Card management, this, that, and the other. And to some extent, you have the card management here too. It goes away as you get late in the game, but early in the game, you may want to get rid of some of your 1.1 events that you can discard, and you may not want to play your 3-point events because that'll weaken your deck, etc. I never really like that kind of feel to the play. That's okay on an abstract enough game. I don't mind it. Let's go with Here I Stand, although you don't really do that in Here I Stand. You're not trimming it your own deck. But it wouldn't bother me there. It doesn't bother me in Twilight Struggle to be doing that kind of thing. It does bother me in a game like this, which really is trying to be, it is a war game, okay? I don't care, you know, if you just say, no, CDG can be a war game. Nah, it can be. It has flaws. Every game has flaws, and the CDG design has certain flaws baked into it. But I feel like this one's particularly affected by some of those flaws. It doesn't feel like it was a correct fit, at least for me, even if it might make a pretty decent competitive game underneath, if you're willing to put the effort in to make sure you nail down the rules for yourself. I'm glad I'm done. It means I can go on to the next thing that I'm obligated to do, which is also probably going to be painful, but in a different sort of way. Send this up.